Logan Carter was a man whose name had become synonymous with ambition and luxury. At just 38 years old, he had built an empire of high-end restaurants that catered to the elite. His life was a whirlwind of accolades, deals, and constant motion. Yet, behind the polished exterior and his sharp, media-friendly smile, there lingered a sense of emptiness. Logan had everything money could buy: power, respect, and influence, but the things that truly mattered to most people, such as family or a sense of belonging, eluded him. On the surface, Logan didn't seem like a man who cared about emotional connections. He thrived on control and precision, his days meticulously planned down to the last detail. But as the grand opening of his newest restaurant approached a flagship location that he intended to be the crown jewel of his empire, he found himself growing restless. The restaurant, intriguingly named Origins, was designed to explore the concept of childhood memories through food. It was a risky, avant-garde idea, one that Logan believed could revolutionize the culinary world if executed perfectly. But beneath his professional excitement was something else, a gnawing sense that this project was more personal than he was ready to admit. "Are we still on track for the opening next month?" Logan asked his assistant, Grace, as he leaned back in his leather chair, his eyes scanning the schedule on his tablet. "Yes, but there's one issue," Grace replied cautiously, knowing how little patience Logan had for complications. "The executive chef we had lined up canceled this morning. Apparently a better offer came through, and they backed out." Logan exhaled sharply, setting the tablet down with a thud. Unbelievable. We're weeks away, and this happens now. Grace hesitated before speaking. "I did some digging and found a replacement. She's a bit unconventional, but her reputation is solid in the industry. Her name is Evelyn Moore. She's known for crafting meanness that evokes strong emotional reactions. People say her food has a way of unlocking memories." Logan raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite his irritation. Unlocking memories. That sounds like a marketing gimmick. "It might be," Grace admitted, "but I've seen her work. She's discreet, avoids publicity, and delivers results. If you're serious about the emotional concept behind Origins, she could be the perfect fit." Logan nodded reluctantly. "Fine. Set up a meeting. But if she doesn't match the level of excellence we need, she's out." A week later, Evelyn Moore arrived at Logan's office for their first meeting. She was nothing like what he had expected. In her late 50s, with streaks of silver in her dark hair, she exuded a calm confidence that contrasted sharply with the frenetic energy of Logan's world. She carried herself with a quiet dignity, her eyes sharp and observant. Her chef's uniform was immaculately clean, yet there was a certain weathered quality to her presence, as if she had seen and endured much in her life. "Mr. Carter," she greeted him with a firm handshake. Her voice was low and steady, devoid of the false enthusiasm he often encountered in people desperate to impress him. "Ms. Moore," Logan replied, gesturing for her to sit. "Grace tells me you specialize in menace that evoke emotional responses. Is that true, or is it just clever branding?" Evelyn smiled faintly, unruffled by his bluntness. "It's true, but it's not a gimmick. Food is deeply tied to memory and emotion. A single taste or smell can transport someone back to a moment they thought they'd forgotten. I design my dishes to create that experience." Logan studied her for a moment, trying to gauge her sincerity. "Interesting. But this isn't a therapy session. This is a high-stakes restaurant for some of the most discerning diners in the world. Can you deliver on that level?" "I wouldn't be here if I couldn't," she said simply. Her confidence was both reassuring and slightly unsettling. Logan wasn't used to people meeting him on equal footing, but there was something about Evelyn that made him feel as though she saw through the polished facade he presented to the world. "All right," he said after a moment of silence. "You're hired. But I'll be honest, this is my most important project yet. If you fail, there's no second chance." "I wouldn't expect anything less," she replied, standing to leave. As the weeks went on, Evelyn began working tirelessly to craft the menu for Origins. Logan, ever the perfectionist, insisted on being involved in every detail, which led to several tense exchanges between them. Evelyn was not the type to bend under pressure, and Logan found himself both frustrated and impressed by her unwavering dedication to her vision. One evening, as they reviewed her proposed dishes, Evelyn presented him with a dessert she called Childhood Echo. The plate was simple, almost rustic, a departure from the elaborate presentations Logan was accustomed to. But the moment he took a bite, he felt something stir within him, an inexplicable wave of nostalgia. This is incredible," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "How did you come up with this?" Evelyn hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "It's based on something from my past. I find that the simplest dishes often hold the deepest memories." Logan didn't press her further, but her words stayed with him long after the tasting ended. That night, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Evelyn than she let on. Something about her dishes, about the way she carried herself, felt oddly familiar. Unbeknownst to Logan, Evelyn had her own reasons for taking this job. For years, she had lived with a secret, one that had shaped every decision she had ever made. Working with Logan wasn't just another professional challenge, it was a chance to right a wrong, to confront a past she had spent decades running from. And as the opening of Origins drew closer, it became clear that this restaurant would not only change the culinary world, but also unravel truths that neither Logan nor Evelyn were prepared to face. The evening of the pre-opening tasting was one of meticulous preparation, and Logan Carter thrived in such environments. Every detail, every plate, and every word spoken to the elite group of guests who had been invited carried the weight of his reputation. Yet tonight there was a tension in the air that Logan couldn't quite place. He couldn't decide if it was the pressure of launching Origins or the nagging questions that had begun to surface about Evelyn Moore. For weeks, Logan had watched Evelyn work in the kitchen with almost obsessive precision. She wasn't like any chef he'd worked with before. While others bowed to his demands, Evelyn seemed to listen only out of politeness, adjusting her dishes not based on his feedback but on something intangible, something she alone understood. Her menus were layered, emotionally charged, and more than once, Logan had found himself wondering if she was toying with him, challenging his control over his own restaurant. The dining room was set. Guests began to arrive, greeted by the soft glow of candlelight and the quiet notes of a harpist tucked into the corner. Logan played his role as host flawlessly, moving from table to table, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries. But all the while, his mind was elsewhere. Tonight, Evelyn's final dish would be unveiled, a dessert that had remained a mystery to him. She had refused to let him taste it in advance, claiming it would lose its meaning if experienced in the sterile setting of a prep kitchen. It was an excuse that had frustrated him, yet he hadn't pushed her further, a rare concession on his part. When the dessert finally arrived, Logan felt a strange, almost electric anticipation. The dish was simple, almost underwhelming in appearance, a small tart with a faintly golden crust, topped with a light syrup and a garnish of candied citrus peel. He picked up his fork and hesitated, glancing around the table to gauge the reactions of his guests. But they were already engrossed, taking their first bites with quiet reverence. Logan finally took a bite, and everything changed. The taste was immediate and overwhelming. The buttery crust melted in his mouth, its subtle sweetness balanced perfectly by the tang of the citrus. But it wasn't just the flavors. As he chewed, something deep inside him stirred, a memory, distant yet vivid, rushing to the surface like water breaking through a dam. He was 5 years old, sitting in a small kitchen. The room was bathed in golden afternoon light, the smell of something baking filling the air. A woman stood by the stove, humming softly, her voice warm and familiar. Logan couldn't see her face clearly, but the sound of her voice and the sense of comfort it brought him were unmistakable. She turned, placing a tart on the table in front of him, and he felt an overwhelming sense of love and security, feelings he hadn't associated with his childhood in decades. Logan set down his fork abruptly, his heart pounding. He glanced around the table again, but no one seemed to notice his reaction. Some of the guests were smiling, their expressions distant, as if the dessert had unlocked their own private memories. Others were quiet, savoring each bite with the focus of someone trying to hold on to something fleeting. Evelyn appeared at his side, her expression calm but watchful. "How is it?" she asked, her voice low enough that only he could hear. Logan struggled to find the words. "It's incredible," he said finally. "But there's something about it. It reminds me of something from when I was a child." Evelyn's eyes flickered, a fleeting reaction that Logan almost missed. "That's the idea," she said evenly. "This dessert is meant to evoke those kinds of memories. Food has a way of connecting us to the past." Logan shook his head. "No, it's more than that. It's not just a feeling. It's specific. I can see it. A moment, a kitchen. It's like I've been there before." Evelyn said nothing for a moment, her gaze steady and unreadable. "Finally," she said, "sometimes a taste is enough to bring back something we thought we'd forgotten." Before Logan could press her further, she excused herself, moving to another table where a guest had waved her over. Logan watched her go, his mind racing. By the time the evening ended and the last guest had left, Logan was no closer to understanding what had happened. He stayed behind in the now empty dining room, staring at the remnants of the tart on his plate. The memory it had triggered felt fragile, like it might slip away if he didn't hold on to it tightly. Unable to shake the feeling that Evelyn was somehow connected to this, Logan made his way to the kitchen. He found her there, alone, cleaning her station with the same care and precision she brought to everything she did. She looked up as he entered, her expression neutral. "Still here?" she asked, her tone light but her eyes wary. "I need to know something," Logan said, coming to stand across from her. "That dessert tonight, it was more than just a recipe. It unlocked something in me, something I haven't thought about in years. And I can't shake the feeling that you knew it would." Evelyn didn't look away, but there was a tension in her posture now, a stillness that hadn't been there before. "What are you asking me, Mr. Carter? Did you make that dessert for me?" he demanded. "Is there something you're not telling me?" Evelyn sighed, setting down the cloth she'd been using to wipe the counter. "Why does it matter so much to you?" "Because I grew up in a foster home," Logan said, his voice rising slightly. "I don't remember my birth parents. I don't remember anything about my life before I was 5. But that dessert, it brought something back. A woman's voice. A kitchen. I don't know what it means, but I can't ignore it." For the first time, Evelyn seemed to falter. She looked away, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. When she spoke, her voice was quieter. "Sometimes food connects us to people we've lost, to moments we've buried. Maybe that dessert reminded you of someone who loved you." "That's not an answer," Logan snapped. "It's the only one I can give you right now," she said, meeting his gaze once more. "Good night, Mr. Carter." She walked out before he could stop her, leaving Logan alone in the kitchen. He stared after her, his mind racing. Who was Evelyn Moore, really? And why did he feel like she knew more about him than she was letting on? The next morning, Logan arrived at the restaurant early, determined to confront her again. But when he walked into the kitchen, she was gone. One of the sous chefs handed him a folded piece of paper, explaining that Evelyn had left it for him. Logan unfolded the note, his pulse quickening. Some connections take time to understand. Look for me where it all began. --E.M. Logan stared at the note, frustration and curiosity warring within him. He didn't know what she meant, but one thing was certain. Evelyn Moore wasn't just another chef. She was the key to a part of his life he thought he'd lost forever. And now, he had no choice but to follow her trail. Logan Carter wasn't a man who let things go unanswered. The moment he read Evelyn's cryptic note, frustration simmered beneath his otherwise composed demeanor. "Look for me where it all began," she had written. It wasn't much to go on, and the deliberate ambiguity only made him more determined to uncover what Evelyn was hiding. His first step was reaching out to Grace, his assistant, who could unearth anything or anyone with enough incentive. She was used to Logan's demands, but his intensity this time felt different. He handed her the note and said, "Find out where this woman came from. I don't care what it takes. Start with her employment history and dig deeper from there." Grace raised an eyebrow. "You think she's a threat? Or something else?" Logan didn't answer right away. He stared at the note again, his mind replaying the memory of the dessert, the phantom taste of childhood that had jolted something awake inside him. "I don't know what she is," he said finally, "but I need answers." Over the next 2 days, Grace worked tirelessly, piecing together fragments of Evelyn Moore's life. She found that Evelyn had spent years working under the radar, her career dotted with brief stints at high-profile kitchens before she'd disappear without explanation. She had no public presence, no interviews, no social media, no photographs. It was almost as if she'd intentionally erased herself. But there was one lead. Before her rise as a chef, Evelyn had worked as a cook at a small children's shelter just outside the city, a shelter that had closed over 20 years ago. When Grace presented this information, Logan's chest tightened. He hadn't thought about his time in foster care in years, but the connection was impossible to ignore. The dates aligned. If Evelyn had been working at the shelter during the time he'd been there as a child, no, it was too much of a coincidence. "I'm going there," Logan said abruptly, rising from his chair. Grace blinked. "To the shelter?" "Logan, it's abandoned." "What do you think you'll find?" "Something she didn't want me to forget," Logan replied, already grabbing his coat. "And if she left a clue, I'm going to find it." The drive to the old children's shelter was long and solitary, giving Logan too much time to think. Memories he'd buried deep began to resurface, fragmented and incomplete. He remembered the gray walls of the shelter, the faded murals painted by older kids, and the small, cold room he'd shared with 3 other boys. But most of all, he remembered the emptiness, a sense of being unwanted, of waiting for someone who never came. When he arrived, the building was exactly as Grace had described, abandoned and decaying, the windows boarded up and the front gate hanging loose on its hinges. The shelter had once been a place of refuge, but now it looked haunted, a shell of its former self. Logan hesitated for a moment, then pushed open the gate and stepped inside. The interior was eerily silent, the air thick with dust. Logan walked through the empty halls, his footsteps echoing off the cracked tiles. He found the dining hall first, its long tables and benches covered in grime. Faded drawings still adorned the walls, stick figures of smiling children holding hands under a bright sun. But there was no joy in this place anymore. As Logan wandered deeper into the building, he began to notice small details that felt oddly familiar: a chipped railing on the staircase, a patch of peeling wallpaper shaped like a cloud. Each one tugged at something in his memory, but it wasn't until he entered the old kitchen that he felt the full weight of the past crash down on him. The kitchen was almost untouched, as if time had forgotten it. Pots and pans hung on rusted hooks, and an old wooden table sat in the center of the room. Logan ran his hand along the table's surface, his fingers brushing against grooves carved into the wood. He leaned closer and realized they were initials, dozens of them, scratched into the table by countless children over the years. His gaze stopped on one set of initials, LC. Logan Carter. He'd carved those letters himself, though he couldn't remember when or why. The sight of them made his chest ache. He sat down at the table, his mind racing, and that's when he saw a folded piece of paper tucked under the edge of the table. His hands trembled as he pulled it free and unfolded it. The note was written in the same elegant handwriting as Evelyn's first message. Some things are worth remembering. Do you? Beneath the note was a small drawing, one that Logan recognized immediately. It was a crude sketch of a tart, the same dessert Evelyn had served at the restaurant. Next to it was a single word, home. Logan's breath caught. The memory came rushing back, clearer this time, a woman standing in this very kitchen, her back to him as she worked at the stove. She had been humming a song, the melody soft and comforting. He had asked her something. What had he asked? The memory slipped away before he could grasp it fully, leaving him with more questions than answers. Why did you bring me here, Evelyn? He muttered under his breath. As if in response, his phone buzzed. It was Grace. Logan, I think I found something else, she said, her tone urgent. There's a charity event tonight at the old community center downtown. Evelyn's name is on the guest list. I think she might be there. Logan stood, his jaw tightening. Send me the details. I'm on my way. The community center was a stark contrast to the shelter, lively, well-lit, and filled with people. Logan walked through the crowd, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of Evelyn. He finally spotted her near the back, standing by a table of hors d'oeuvres. She wasn't wearing her chef's uniform this time, but a simple black dress that made her seem almost unrecognizable. Yet there was no mistaking her. Logan approached her, his steps quick and deliberate. She turned just as he reached her, and for a moment their eyes met. There was no surprise on her face, only a quiet resignation. You've been leading me on a chase, Logan said, keeping his voice low. And you followed, Evelyn replied calmly, which means you're ready. Ready for what? He demanded. You brought me to that shelter. You made me relive things I haven't thought about in years. Why? What are you trying to tell me? Evelyn gestured toward a quiet corner of the room. Let's talk. Once they were seated, Evelyn took a deep breath. Logan, I didn't take the job at your restaurant by accident. I've been following your career for years. I knew who you were the moment I walked into your office. Logan stared at her, stunned. Why? What do you want from me? It's not about what I want, she said softly. It's about what you deserve to know. She paused, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I worked at that shelter when you were a child. I was the cook there, but I wasn't just another staff member. I was supposed to be more to you. What are you saying? Logan's voice was barely above a whisper. I'm your mother, Evelyn said, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to let fall. I left you at that shelter because I thought it was the only way to keep you safe, and I've regretted it every day since. Logan felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of memories, feelings, and the strange sense of familiarity he'd felt around Evelyn from the start. I didn't want to disrupt your life, Evelyn continued, her voice trembling. I thought if I could just see you, be a part of your world in some small way, it would be enough. But then I realized I owed you the truth. Logan finally found his voice. You think showing up now is enough, after everything? No, Evelyn admitted. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know the truth. The rest is up to you. Logan stood abruptly, his emotions too raw to process. I need time. Evelyn nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks as she watched him walk away. Logan Carter could barely process the weight of Evelyn's revelation as he walked away from the charity event. The words echoed in his mind, reverberating against every carefully constructed wall he had built over the years. I'm your mother. It felt surreal, like a poorly written twist in a story he wasn't sure he wanted to be part of. How could this woman, calm, reserved, and meticulous, be the same person who had abandoned him to a childhood defined by loneliness and instability? The questions burned in his chest, the answers eluding him as if hidden just out of reach. He drove aimlessly through the city, the buzz of the streetlights blurring into streaks of color on the rain-streaked windshield. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, as memories from his childhood began to surface. He saw flashes of moments he had long since buried: the cold walls of the children's shelter, the smell of industrial-strength cleaner mixed with overcooked oatmeal, and the sound of his own small voice calling out into the silence, wondering if anyone was coming for him. No one ever had. Eventually, Logan found himself parked in front of his apartment, though he couldn't remember driving there. The air inside the car was stifling, yet he couldn't bring himself to move. The memory of the tart Evelyn had served him at the restaurant crept back into his mind. It wasn't just the taste that had struck him, it was the feeling, the unmistakable sense of being transported to a place he hadn't visited in decades. That tart had been more than food. It had been a key, unlocking something long forgotten. And Evelyn had known. She had planned it. The next morning, Logan's exhaustion weighed heavily on him as he stepped into his office, but his determination burned brighter than ever. He called Grace in, his voice sharp and decisive. "We need everything on Evelyn Moore," he said, tossing her the cryptic note Evelyn had left him. "Where she's been, where she came from, every place she's worked. She said I'd find her where it all began. I need to know what that means." Grace didn't ask questions, she simply nodded and got to work. Hours later, she returned, her usually calm expression tinged with hesitation. In her hands was a thick folder. "I wasn't sure if I should give this to you," she began carefully, "but there's a lot here. You might want to brace yourself." Logan snatched the folder from her hands, flipping through the contents. The pages detailed Evelyn's life over the past 3 decades, but it wasn't the timeline that caught his attention, it was the letters. Handwritten notes, addressed to the director of the very shelter where Logan had spent much of his childhood. In one letter, dated shortly after Logan had been placed in foster care, Evelyn had written, "I need to know if Logan is safe. Please tell him I love him, even if I can never tell him myself." The words hit Logan like a blow to the chest. He scanned further, finding records of small donations made anonymously to the shelter, scattered across years, as if Evelyn had been trying to stay connected in the only way she could. "She never stopped," Grace said quietly. "She wrote, she donated, she tried to stay involved, even if it was from a distance." Logan's throat tightened as he set the papers down. "If she cared so much, why didn't she come back for me?" he demanded, his voice sharp with the edge of old wounds. Grace hesitated. "I don't know. But there's more. I traced her back to the time she worked at the shelter. She was employed as a cook, but it looks like she left suddenly. No explanation. After that, she bounced around for years, different cities, odd jobs before she resurfaced as a chef. And then she came here." The weight of it all settled heavily on Logan's shoulders. Evelyn had been close enough to reach out, yet she hadn't. She'd watched from a distance, leaving him to grow up without her, to carve out a life built on the belief that he had been left behind. And now, here she was, walking back into his life with answers he wasn't sure he wanted. That evening, Logan made his decision. He sent Evelyn a message, "Meet me at Origins tonight. No games. I want the truth." When Evelyn arrived, the restaurant was empty, its polished surfaces gleaming under the dim lighting. She walked in with the same quiet grace she always carried, but there was a tension in her posture, a hesitance that hadn't been there before. Logan stood by one of the tables, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for coming," he said curtly. Evelyn nodded but said nothing as she took a seat across from him. Logan didn't waste time. "Why now?" he demanded. "After all these years, why come back now?" Evelyn folded her hands in front of her, her gaze steady but somber. "Because I couldn't stay away anymore. I thought I was doing the right thing when I left you at the shelter. I thought you'd have a better chance at life without me. But I've regretted that decision every day since." Logan's jaw tightened. "And that regret kept you from coming back?" "It wasn't just regret," Evelyn said quietly. "It was fear. I was terrified you wouldn't forgive me, that you'd hate me for what I'd done. And by the time I found the courage to face you, so much time had passed, I didn't know if it was fair to disrupt your life. You think you had the right to make that decision for me." Logan shot back, his voice rising. "You abandoned me. Do you have any idea what that did to me?" Evelyn flinched but didn't look away. "I know, and I won't make excuses for it, but I never stopped loving you, Logan. Not for 1 second." Logan looked away, his hands clenched into fists. He wanted to scream, to demand why she hadn't fought harder, why she hadn't been there when he needed her most. But beneath the anger was something he hated to admit, a longing he had buried for so long it felt foreign now. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Logan said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Evelyn replied. "I'm asking for a chance. A chance to show you that I'm not the same person who made that mistake all those years ago." For a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Evelyn reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. Its leather cover was worn, the pages inside frayed at the edges. She placed it on the table and slid it toward Logan. "What's this?" he asked warily. "It's a part of me," Evelyn said. "When I worked at the shelter, I kept this notebook. I wrote down recipes, little notes about the kids, things I wanted to remember. That tart you loved so much it came from here. It was your favorite." Logan hesitated before opening the notebook. Inside, the pages were filled with handwritten recipes, along with small sketches and scribbled observations. He turned to one page in particular and froze. Logan's favorite citrus tart, the heading read. The memory hit him like a tidal wave. He saw himself sitting at the kitchen table in the shelter, swinging his legs as he waited for the tart to cool. Evelyn had been there, humming softly as she worked. For the first time, he could clearly see her face, young, tired but smiling as she placed the tart in front of him. "I remember this," Logan said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Evelyn smiled faintly. "You used to say it made you feel like home." The word cut through Logan like a knife. Home. It was what he had spent his entire life chasing, building an empire in the hope of creating something stable, something lasting. And now, the woman who had abandoned him claimed to be the source of that feeling. "I don't know where this goes," Logan said finally, closing the notebook. "But if you want a chance, you're going to have to be honest with me about everything." Evelyn nodded, her expression resolute. "No more secrets, I promise." For the first time, Logan felt a crack in the wall he had built around himself. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. Logan Carter had always believed in confronting problems head-on. It was the foundation of his success, the reason he had risen to the top of the competitive culinary world while others faltered. Yet now, faced with the truth of Evelyn's identity and the weight of her reappearance in his life, he found himself hesitating. The clarity he prided himself on was gone, replaced by confusion, anger, and a lingering sense of betrayal that refused to let go. For days after their confrontation in the restaurant, Logan avoided Evelyn entirely. He buried himself in work, focusing on the final preparations for the grand opening of Origins, using the chaos of the restaurant to drown out the questions that haunted him. Why had she really come back? Why now? And, most painfully, why had she stayed away for so long? But the notebook wouldn't let him forget. Every time he opened it, he was drawn deeper into Evelyn's past. The notes, the recipes, the small observations, it was as if the pages were speaking directly to him, challenging the narrative he had built about her over the years. One entry in particular stood out, scrawled in the margins of a recipe for oatmeal cookies. Logan loves these. He says they remind him of being safe. I hope I can keep giving him that. The words hit Logan like a punch to the gut. He could barely remember the woman Evelyn had been then, but this entry, raw, unfiltered, and filled with love, was undeniable proof that she had cared for him in a way he had convinced himself she never had. The walls Logan had spent years building around his heart were beginning to crumble, and he didn't know how to stop it. Then Grace brought him the file. It was late in the evening when she knocked on his office door, her expression more serious than usual. I found something, she said, holding up a slim folder. But I need you to be sure you want to see this before I hand it over. Logan frowned, sitting up straighter in his chair. Of course I want to see it. That's why I asked you to dig into her past. Grace hesitated, her fingers tightening on the folder. Logan, this isn't just about her leaving you. There's more to the story, and it's not easy to hear. I don't need easy, Logan snapped, though his irritation was more a reflection of his own unease than anything Grace had done. I need the truth. With a resigned nod, Grace handed over the folder and stepped back, watching as Logan opened it. The first thing he saw was a police report, its yellowed pages detailing a domestic disturbance at an apartment complex nearly 2 decades ago. The name at the top of the report was unmistakable, Evelyn Moore. Logan's eyes scanned the document, his heart pounding as the words blurred together. Suspected domestic violence. Male suspect identified as Daniel Price. Victim declined to press charges. His hands trembled as he turned the page, revealing a copy of a restraining order filed against the same man. She was in an abusive relationship, Grace said quietly. It looks like it went on for years. She moved a lot during that time, different cities, different jobs. She probably stayed under the radar to avoid him. Logan barely heard her. His mind was racing, trying to reconcile this new information with the image he had of Evelyn in his head. For so long, he had seen her as the villain of his story, the woman who had abandoned him without a second thought. But now, for the first time, he began to see her as someone else entirely, a woman who had been running for her life, trying to survive in a world that had given her few options. She still could have come back, Logan said finally, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Maybe she thought she was protecting you, Grace suggested. Or maybe she didn't think she had a choice. Logan didn't respond. He couldn't. Instead, he closed the folder and stood, his expression unreadable. Thanks, Grace. That'll be all for now. But it wasn't enough. The questions gnawed at him, growing louder with each passing hour. By the next morning, Logan couldn't take it anymore. He stormed into the kitchen where Evelyn was working, his presence commanding enough to make the other chefs fall silent. Everyone out, he barked, his voice leaving no room for argument. The staff scattered, leaving him alone with Evelyn, who stood by the stove with a knife in her hand and a look of quiet resignation on her face. We need to talk, Logan said, his tone sharp. Evelyn nodded, setting the knife down and turning to face him. All right, she said. What do you want to know? Logan held up the folder, his grip tight. Daniel Price. The police report. The restraining order. Is it true? Evelyn's face paled, but she didn't look away. For a moment, the kitchen was so silent that Logan could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator. Yes, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. It's true. Why didn't you tell me? Logan demanded, his voice rising. You've been talking about honesty, about no more secrets, but you left this out. Why? Evelyn exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging under the weight of his words. Because it's not something I'm proud of, she admitted, and because I didn't think it would make a difference. I left you, Logan. No matter what my reasons were, that doesn't change the fact that I wasn't there when you needed me. Logan stared at her, his chest tightening. You could have come back, he said, though the anger in his voice was laced with something else, hurt, vulnerability. You could have fought harder. I did fight, Evelyn said, her voice trembling. I fought every day to stay alive, to keep myself safe so that one day, maybe, I could find my way back to you. But by the time I got out of that relationship, years had passed. And I thought it was too late. The raw emotion in her voice cut through Logan's defenses, leaving him unsure of what to say. He had spent so long blaming her for everything that had gone wrong in his life. But now, faced with the reality of her pain, he didn't know how to reconcile his anger with the sympathy creeping into his heart. I don't know how to forgive you, Logan said finally, his voice trembling. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Evelyn replied softly. I'm asking for a chance. A chance to prove that I'm not the same person who made that mistake all those years ago. Logan turned away, running a hand through his hair as he tried to collect his thoughts. The truth was, he didn't know what he wanted. Part of him wanted to yell, to demand answers for every moment of pain he had endured because of her absence. But another part of him, the part he didn't like to acknowledge, wanted to believe her. I can't promise anything, he said finally, his voice tight. If you want to stay, you're going to have to earn it. No more secrets, no more lies, everything. Understand? Evelyn nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. I understand, she said. And I promise, Logan, I'll prove to you that I'm worth it. The days that followed were tense, filled with unspoken words and cautious glances. Evelyn continued to work in the kitchen, her presence a steady reminder of everything Logan was trying to process. And though he still kept his distance, he couldn't ignore the way she carried herself with quiet strength and an unwavering determination to make things right. One evening, Logan found himself sitting in his apartment, staring at the notebook once again. This time, instead of focusing on the words, he let himself remember. The smell of citrus, the sound of Evelyn humming as she worked, the warmth of her smile as she placed a tart in front of him, all of it came rushing back, vivid and undeniable. Maybe, Logan thought, this wasn't the end of the story. Maybe it was the beginning. Here's the 6th-part climax written as a single, cohesive block of text with approximately 8,000 characters. Logan Carter stared at the empty dining room of Origins, his reflection barely visible in the darkened glass of the windows. The grand opening had been a resounding success, as every critic, investor, and high-profile guest left raving about the innovative menu and transformative experience. By all measurable accounts, this night was everything Logan had worked for. Yet, as he stood there in the silence, the accolades felt hollow. The restless ache in his chest refused to subside, and he knew exactly why. Evelyn had been there, of course. She had worked quietly in the kitchen, avoiding the spotlight as always, though her influence was present in every dish served. Throughout the evening, Logan had caught glimpses of her, a fleeting shadow moving behind the pass, her head bowed in concentration as she added the final touches to a dish. She hadn't approached him. and he hadn't approached her. There was too much unsaid between them, too many emotions swirling beneath the surface, threatening to boil over if either of them broke the fragile truce they'd been maintaining. But now, with the guests gone and the staff beginning their cleanup, Logan found himself unable to leave. Something kept him rooted to the spot, his mind replaying fragments of their conversations, the hurt in her eyes when he demanded answers, and the tentative hope in her voice when she promised to stay. Finally, Logan made his decision. He turned and headed toward the kitchen, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. He found Evelyn standing at the far counter, meticulously wrapping leftovers and labeling them for the staff. She didn't look up when he entered, but he could tell by the slight tension in her shoulders that she knew he was there. "We need to talk," Logan said, his voice firm but not unkind. Evelyn set down the plastic wrap and turned to face him, her expression carefully neutral. "All right," she said softly. "What is it?" For a moment, Logan hesitated. Now that he was standing in front of her, the words he had been rehearsing in his head felt inadequate. How could he articulate the storm of emotions that had been building inside him for weeks? The anger, the confusion, the tentative glimmers of something he wasn't ready to name, it all felt too big, too raw. "Why did you stay tonight?" he asked finally. "You didn't have to. The menu was set. The team could have handled it without you. So why did you stay?" Evelyn's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. "Because I wanted to see it," she said. "What you've built here, it's extraordinary, Logan. I wanted to be part of it, even if it was just from the background." Logan shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "That's not an answer. You keep saying you want to be part of my life, but all you do is hover on the edges, waiting for me to make the first move. I don't know how to deal with that, Evelyn. I don't know how to deal with you." Evelyn's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet resignation. "I don't know how to deal with this either," she admitted. "I've spent so long thinking about what I'd say to you if I ever got the chance, but now that I'm here, nothing feels right. I want to tell you how sorry I am, but I know that doesn't change anything. I want to tell you how much I've missed you, but I don't have the right to say that. So I stay in the background because I don't know what else to do." Her words cut through Logan like a knife, stripping away the armor he had wrapped around himself. He didn't know what he had expected her to say, but the raw honesty in her voice left him feeling exposed. "You think I don't want to let you in," Logan said, his voice quieter now. "But the truth is, I don't know how. I've spent my whole life keeping people at arm's length because it's easier than getting hurt again. And now, here you are, asking me to let you in after all this time, after everything. I don't know if I can do that." Evelyn stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. "I'm not asking you to trust me right away," she said. "I know I have to earn that. But please, Logan, don't shut me out completely. Let me prove to you that I can be someone you can rely on." For a long moment they stood in silence, the tension between them thick and heavy. Logan wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that she could be the mother he had longed for as a child, that they could somehow rebuild what had been lost. But the fear of being hurt again loomed large, threatening to drown out the hope he was beginning to feel. Finally he spoke. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said, "but I'm willing to try." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. "That's all I can ask," she said. Logan nodded, a small, tentative gesture that felt like the first crack in the wall he had spent years building around himself. "There's one thing I need to know," he said. "Why the tart? Why did you make that for the menu?" Evelyn smiled faintly, her voice trembling with emotion. "Because it was your favorite," she said. "And because it was the only way I knew how to reach you. I thought, maybe if I could remind you of those moments we shared, even if they were small, you'd see that I was still connected to you, even after all these years." Logan closed his eyes, the memory of those moments flooding back with startling clarity, the warmth of the kitchen, the sound of Evelyn humming as she worked, the taste of the tart that always seemed to make everything feel okay, even if just for a little while. When he opened his eyes, Evelyn was watching him, her expression filled with both hope and trepidation. "I'm not promising anything," Logan said, "but I'm willing to see where this goes." Evelyn nodded, her smile returning, softer this time but no less genuine. "That's enough for me," she said. For the first time in years, Logan felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time, the possibility of healing. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. The morning after the grand opening of Origins, the city's culinary circles were abuzz with praise. Critics called it a triumph, a revolution in fine dining, and an emotional journey captured on a plate. Logan Carter's phone was flooded with messages from investors, journalists, and admirers, all eager to congratulate him. Yet, as he sat at his desk in his quiet office, the noise felt distant, almost meaningless. For the first time in his life, success didn't feel like an endpoint. It felt like a beginning, one that was as terrifying as it was uncertain. Logan glanced at the leather-bound notebook, sitting on the edge of his desk, its frayed edges a constant reminder of Evelyn's presence. The previous night's conversation played over and over in his mind. He had offered her a chance, not forgiveness, not acceptance, but the possibility of something more. And though it had taken everything in him to do so, he couldn't deny the small measure of peace it brought. He hadn't seen Evelyn that morning. She had left the restaurant before dawn, leaving only a note for the staff thanking them for their hard work and promising to return for the next service. Logan wasn't sure if her absence was intentional or if she simply needed space. Either way, it gave him time to think. By late afternoon, Logan made his decision. He drove to a small neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, where Grace had told him Evelyn had rented a modest apartment. The building was old but well-maintained, with flower pots lining the balconies and the faint sound of children playing in the courtyard. Logan hesitated at the door to her unit, his hand hovering over the doorbell. Before he could press it, the door opened, and there she was. Evelyn seemed startled to see him, her eyes widening briefly before softening into something unreadable. "Logan," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I wasn't expecting you." "I wasn't sure if I'd come," he admitted, stepping into the small living room. The space was tidy but sparse, with only a few personal touches, a stack of cookbooks on the coffee table, a framed photo of a much younger Evelyn standing beside an elderly woman he didn't recognize. Evelyn motioned for him to sit, but Logan remained standing, his gaze wandering around the room. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," he began, his tone measured. "About wanting to prove yourself, about earning a place in my life." Evelyn nodded, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I meant every word," she said. Logan turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "If you're serious about that, then I need you to understand something. This, whatever this is between us, it's going to take time. I don't know how to be a son to you, Evelyn. I don't even know if I want to be, but I'm willing to try." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she nodded, her voice steady despite the emotion in her face. "That's all I'm asking, Logan. Just a chance." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy with the weight of unspoken feelings. Finally, Logan gestured toward the notebook in his hand. "I thought you might want this back," he said. Evelyn smiled faintly. "It's yours now," she said. "I gave it to you because it belongs to you as much as it does to me. Those memories, they're part of both of us." Logan stared at the notebook for a long moment before setting it down on the coffee table. "If we're going to do this, then we start fresh," he said firmly. "No more hiding. No more running. If you want to be part of my life, you have to be honest with me about everything. I will be, Evelyn promised. No more secrets. Satisfied, Logan nodded. All right. Then let's start with something simple. He gestured toward the photo on the table. Who's the woman in the picture? Evelyn's expression softened as she picked up the frame, her fingers tracing the edge of the glass. That's my grandmother, she said. She raised me after my parents died. She's the one who taught me how to cook. Logan's gaze lingered on the photo, trying to imagine the life Evelyn had lived before he was born. She looks kind, he said finally. She was, Evelyn said, her voice warm with nostalgia. She always said food was a way of showing love, even when words failed. I guess that's something I've carried with me my whole life. Logan didn't respond, but he filed the information away, another piece of the puzzle that was Evelyn Moore. Over the next few weeks, their relationship began to shift, slowly and tentatively. Evelyn continued working at Origins, though she kept to the background, letting Logan take the spotlight. They spoke occasionally, their conversations brief but meaningful, each one peeling back another layer of the distance between them. One evening, Logan found himself in the kitchen after hours, watching as Evelyn prepared a dish for the next day's menu. She moved with quiet confidence, her hands steady as she chopped, stirred, and plated. You still hum when you cook, Logan observed, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Evelyn paused, glancing up at him with a small smile. Old habits, she said. I used to hum for you when you were little. You always said it made the food taste better. Logan chuckled softly, the sound surprising both of them. Maybe it did, he admitted. It wasn't a breakthrough, but it was something, a moment of connection that felt real and unforced. The turning point came a month later, on the anniversary of the restaurant's opening. Logan had invited the entire staff to a celebratory dinner, and Evelyn had reluctantly agreed to join. She sat quietly at the end of the table, listening as the team shared stories and laughter, her presence unobtrusive but appreciated. Toward the end of the meal, Logan stood, raising his glass for a toast. I want to thank all of you for making Origins what it is today, he began. This place isn't just a restaurant, it's a reflection of everything we believe in: connection, memory, and the power of food to bring people together. His gaze shifted to Evelyn, who looked back at him with wide, uncertain eyes. And there's one person here who's reminded me of that more than anyone, Logan continued. Evelyn, your talent and your heart are the reason this place exists. I don't say it enough, but thank you. The room erupted into applause, but Evelyn's focus was entirely on Logan. For the first time, she saw not just a successful businessman, but the boy she had left behind, now grown into a man who was willing to let her try again. Later that night, as they cleaned up the dining room together, Logan turned to Evelyn and said something he hadn't been able to say before. I'm glad you stayed. Evelyn's smile was soft but radiant, and for the first time, Logan felt like they were on equal footing, not as a mother and son with a fractured past, but as two people trying to build something new. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.